The day I received the letter, I read it twice, set it on my kitchen counter, made myself a cup of coffee, and then called my assistant to confirm my reservation at Meridian for Thursday evening. Same restaurant, same night, different table. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not someone who plans for revenge. I never have been. What happened at that dinner was not something I engineered or orchestrated or fantasized about during long drives home. It happened because I had spent 11 years building a life that didn't require my father's permission. And sometimes, life has a way of making a point more clearly than any argument ever could. But let me back up. I grew up in a house where the word legacy was used the way other families use the word love. Constantly, reverently, as though it explained everything and excused everything at the same time. My father built a regional construction company from almost nothing, starting with a single crew and a pickup truck and a reputation for showing up on time. By the time I was 10 years old, the company had 40 employees and contracts across 3 counties. By the time I was in high school, it had a name people recognized. My father was proud of that. I understood his pride. I still do. What I could not understand, and what I spent the better part of my childhood trying to make peace with, was the way that pride seemed to have a very specific shape. It fit my brothers. It did not fit me. There were 3 of us. My older brother came first, then me, then my younger brother 4 years later. From the time I can remember, the company was discussed at dinner as a thing that belonged to the 2 of them, not in a whispered, secretive way. Openly, matter-of-factly, the way you'd say the sky is blue. My older brother would run operations. My younger brother would handle sales. These were not conversations I was invited to participate in. When I asked once, I was maybe 12, what I would do, my father looked at me with something that wasn't quite unkindness but wasn't warmth either, and said, "You'll marry well and be taken care of. That's more than most." I didn't argue. I went upstairs and I studied harder. My mother heard him say it. She was standing at the stove with her back to us and she didn't turn around. I noticed that. I noticed it the way you notice things as a child that you don't have language for yet, things that settle somewhere in your chest and wait. I was a good student. Not just good. My guidance counselor called my parents in junior year and told them I should be applying to top law schools after college, that she had rarely seen a student with my clarity of analytical thinking. My father nodded and thanked her, and on the drive home told me not to get ahead of myself. My mother reached back from the passenger seat and squeezed my hand. I got a full scholarship to college. My father told his friends I was attending a state school and left out the scholarship part. I noticed that too. Law school was 3 years of eating ramen and sleeping 5 hours a night and loving every second of it. I graduated in the top 4% of my class. I accepted a position at Hartley & Crane, one of the most respected litigation firms in the state. I was 26 years old, and I was terrified, and I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I called my father to tell him. There was a pause on his end that lasted long enough for me to count my own heartbeats. Then he said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Your brother just landed the Kellerman contract. It's worth $2 million over 3 years." Then he told me he had to go. I held the phone for a long time after he hung up. I want to tell you about my nephew before I tell you the rest, because he matters to this story in a way that still makes my throat tighten when I think about it. My older brother's son was born when I was 28. He was the kind of child who made you believe in goodness just by existing wide brown eyes, a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his stomach, the habit of asking questions that had no comfortable answers. I loved him immediately and completely. I was at their house for a Sunday dinner about a year before everything happened, and he was sitting on my lap while my older brother and my father talked about the company at the kitchen table. My father kept a framed photograph of the company's first building project on the wall of his home office. There was another one of my 2 brothers at a groundbreaking ceremony, hard hats and wide smiles. I had walked past those photos my whole life. My nephew looked up at me with those big eyes and said, quietly, in the particular way children have of asking the questions adults have stopped letting themselves ask, "Aunt Claire, how come Grandpa doesn't have your picture in his office? He has Daddy's and Uncle Ryan's." I didn't answer right away. I smoothed his hair back and I told him that Grandpa's office was pretty full already. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, Your picture could go on the other wall. There's space. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I stood at the sink for a while. When I came back out, my older brother was watching me from across the room. He didn't say anything in front of my father, but later, when I was putting on my coat to leave, he followed me to the front door and said, low enough that only I could hear, "For what it's worth, I think he's wrong." I've always thought he was wrong. That was the first time he had ever said it out loud. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice right then. The letter came 6 weeks later. It arrived in an actual envelope, which should have prepared me for what was inside, because my father only used formal correspondence when he wanted distance between himself and what he was communicating. The company hosted an annual dinner every year in late spring. Shareholders, key clients, family members with equity stakes. It was held at Meridian, the nicest restaurant downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a sommelier and a private dining room in the back that my father had rented every year for a decade. The letter said that this year's dinner was being restructured to reflect the company's future direction. Attendance was being limited to shareholders and designated successors. Since I had, as the letter phrased it, pursued an independent path outside the family enterprise, my standing as a family guest would no longer extend to this event. My seat, it explained, had been allocated to my younger brother's new business partner, who would be formally introduced to clients that evening. I was not a shareholder. I had never been offered shares. I had never been offered anything. I read it twice. I made coffee. I called my assistant. Here is what my father did not know, because my father had not asked me about my work in approximately 3 years. 8 months earlier, I had been brought in as lead counsel on a major infrastructure dispute involving the city's redevelopment authority and a private developer. It was the kind of case that got written about in the business section. The kind that, when you settled it favorably, resulted in phone calls from people you had previously only read about. One of those phone calls came from a man named Senator David Hargrove, who sat on the state's Economic Development Committee and had interests in several construction-adjacent ventures. He wanted Hartley and Crane to advise on a public-private project worth more than $20 million. He wanted me, specifically, because word travels in certain circles. We had been in negotiations for 2 months. We were close to finalizing. His preference, communicated through his chief of staff, was for a dinner meeting somewhere upscale and discreet to sign off on the final terms. Somewhere the press didn't tend to linger. Somewhere with a private room, ideally. I suggested Meridian. I want to be very clear about something. I did not know my father had booked the same restaurant on the same night until I called to confirm my reservation, and the host mentioned, warmly, that it would be a busy Thursday, with 2 large private parties. I asked which rooms. He told me. My father's party was in the back private room. I had booked the main dining room's best corner table, the one by the window that the restaurant reserved for VIPs. I thought about it for exactly 45 seconds. Then I kept my reservation exactly as it was. My older brother called me 2 days before the dinner. He had read the letter my father had sent copies to both brothers as a matter of formality, apparently, and he was not pleased. He told me he had tried to argue against it, and my father had shut the conversation down. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, and I believed him both times. I told him not to worry about it. He paused. Then he said, "Are you okay?" I told him I had plans Thursday night anyway. The night of the dinner, I wore the charcoal dress I kept for closing arguments and significant meetings. I arrived at Meridian at 7:15, which was 15 minutes before Senator Hargrove was scheduled to arrive. The maître d' led me to the corner table by the window. The restaurant was warm and full. The kind of ambient noise that signals a room full of people who are exactly where they want to be. My father's party arrived at 7:40. I heard them before I saw them, the particular sound of a group of people who collectively believe the room should be aware of their presence. I did not turn around. I was reviewing a document my assistant had sent over. Something minor I could have addressed the next morning. But having something to look at felt useful in that moment. Senator Hargrove arrived at 7:30, ahead of schedule, with his chief of staff. He was the kind of man who fills a room not through loudness but through the quality of his attention when he looked at you. He was actually looking at you. We shook hands and he said the preliminary terms looked good and he was glad we'd finally found an evening that worked. We were deep into the conversation, somewhere around 8:15, when I became aware of someone standing near our table. I looked up. My father was standing there. He was dressed well. He always dressed well for the company dinners, and he had the expression of a man who has just walked into a room and found the furniture rearranged. He was looking at Senator Hargrove, then he was looking at me, then back at Senator Hargrove, because once you've seen Senator Hargrove's face on the news and in the paper enough times, you recognize it, even in a restaurant. Even when you weren't expecting to. He didn't say anything for a moment. Senator Hargrove looked up pleasantly. He had the politician's instinct for a social moment and the graciousness to fill silence before it became uncomfortable. He extended his hand and introduced himself, the way people with real power often do, simply and without performance. My father shook his hand. His voice, when it came, was smaller than I had ever heard it. He said his name. He said he was in construction. Senator Hargrove nodded and said, genuinely, that construction was the backbone of the state, that he had a great deal of respect for people who built things. He glanced at me with something that I understood to mean he knew whose father this was, and was being kind. We had worked closely enough by then that he had heard something of the shape of my family. My father looked at me then. Not at the senator, not at the room. At me. I met his eyes. I didn't smile or frown. I said, evenly, that it was good to see him, and that I hoped the dinner was going well. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said something that I think was meant to be a congratulation but didn't quite make it all the way there. Then he excused himself and walked back toward the private room. Senator Hargrove picked up his glass and said, quietly, shall we continue? We signed the letters of intent before dessert arrived. What happened in the days after is the part I've thought about more than the dinner itself. My younger brother called me that Friday morning. He led with the company, the usual, and then he said, somewhat awkwardly, that my father had mentioned seeing me at the restaurant. I asked how the dinner had gone. He said fine. There was a pause, and then he said, he didn't know you knew Senator Hargrove. I said that most people didn't know what I was doing, because most people didn't ask. He didn't have an answer for that. My mother called that same afternoon. She cried a little, which she tried to hide and I pretended not to hear. She told me she was proud of me, which was not a sentence I had heard from her very often, not because she wasn't proud but because in our house, pride was a currency allocated in specific directions. She said she had always known I would be something. I told her I knew she had. My father did not call. Not that week. Not the week after. 3 weeks later, my older brother organized a Sunday dinner at his house. Not at my parents' house. At his. He called it a family dinner, but it was more than that. It was him drawing a quiet line, choosing a different table than the one he'd been assigned to. He called me first to make sure I would come. I brought a bottle of wine and arrived early to help set the table. My nephew ran to the door when he heard me ring the bell. He was wearing a shirt with a dinosaur on it, and he had something sticky on his left hand that he wiped on my jacket before I could react, and I didn't mind at all. He grabbed my hand and pulled me inside and said he had something to show me. He led me to the hallway where my older brother had hung family photographs. There was a new frame there, recently hung, slightly lower than the others, so that a 7-year-old could see it clearly. It was a photograph of me at my law school graduation, in my robe, holding my diploma. I had given my brother a copy years ago, and assumed it had gone into a drawer somewhere. My nephew pointed at it and said, with complete satisfaction, I told Daddy you needed a picture on a wall. I crouched down to his level, and I stayed there for longer than I needed to, because I didn't want him to see my face for a moment. My father came to that dinner. He sat across from me, and he was quiet in a way he had never been quiet around me before, not cold, but careful. At one point he passed me the bread before I asked for it. It was such a small thing. In another family it wouldn't have been worth noting. In ours, it was a paragraph. I did not ask for an apology. I did not wait for one. I had spent enough of my life in a waiting room. I was never asked to leave. After dinner, while my older brother and his wife were doing dishes, and my younger brother was on his phone on the back porch, my father sat down next to me on the couch. My nephew was asleep on the armchair across the room, legs dangling, mouth slightly open, looking like every sleeping child looks like proof that some things are still okay. My father looked at him for a long time. Then, he said, without looking at me, that he had been thinking. I waited. He said he supposed he had some things to reconsider about how he had handled certain matters. In my head, I had rehearsed this moment many times over many years. In my rehearsals, I always had something to say, the perfect sentence, the one that would land exactly right and make him understand exactly what it had cost. I had stored up words the way you store up evidence. I was ready. Instead, I said, I know. He nodded. He still wasn't looking at me. He said he didn't want to be a man his grandchildren were confused by. I thought about my nephew asking why there were no pictures. I thought about the particular helplessness of children who love people they cannot fix. I said, then don't be. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. We sat there in the quiet of my brother's living room while my nephew breathed slowly in the armchair and the dishes made soft sounds in the kitchen. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a resolution. It was something earlier than that. Something more tentative, a door left open instead of locked. I drove home that night with the windows down. It was the kind of late spring evening that feels like it was specifically designed to be driven through, warm enough to not need a jacket, cool enough that the air is doing something, the city lights soft and familiar on either side. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story is only worth telling if I'm honest about that part. There was no moment in all of this where I felt the satisfaction of winning, because this was never a competition I wanted to be in. What I felt, pulling out of my brother's neighborhood and onto the highway, was something quieter and more durable than triumph. I felt like myself. Fully, unambiguously myself, not the self that was measured against my brothers, not the self that was tolerated at family dinners, not the self that was sent a formal letter explaining why she didn't belong. Just myself. The one I had been building in the spaces where no one was watching. I had a motion due the following Monday and 3 client calls to prep for. I had a mentorship session with a second-year associate at the firm, who reminded me a little of who I was at 23, sharp and uncertain in equal measure. I had a reservation at a new restaurant my college roommate had been trying to get me to try for 2 months. I had a life that was full in the way I had made it full. By choice, by work, by the accumulation of small, brave decisions over a long time. The letter my father had sent was still on my kitchen counter. I hadn't thrown it away, and I hadn't kept it intentionally. It had just stayed there, the way things do when you're not sure yet what they mean. When I got home that night, I picked it up. Then I folded it in half and put it in the recycling bin and washed my hands and made tea and sat at my kitchen table in the quiet with the window open. Some things are not worth carrying forward, not because they didn't happen, not because they didn't hurt, but because you have somewhere to be and you can't get there carrying all of that weight. I had somewhere to be. I always had somewhere to be. The next morning I was at my desk by 7:15. My coffee was hot, my calendar was full. Through the window of my office on the 14th floor, the city looked exactly like what it was, a place where things got built by people who showed up. My father would say that's what he always admired, showing up. For once, I think he was right about something.